Our scripture lesson for the morning is taken from Mark chapter 10, beginning at verse 35. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What is it you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left hand, in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" They replied, "We are able." Then Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink, you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." When the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called them and said to them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them. But it is not so among you. For whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." This is the end of the scripture lesson.
Reject racism. A rather difficult subject to talk about today. Sometimes we can celebrate the fact that we don't live in the environment of the 60s, and rightfully so. We need to do that. But as adults, I would remind us that racism is still alive and well in our society. In fact, some people would say that racism is more insidious today than it was in the 60s, because today it's more in the background. It's more of an undercurrent that we don't really see. And so, if we're part of the privileged class, we can pretend that it doesn't even exist. But that's a wrong assumption. So what I'd like to do for the next couple minutes is just talk about racism a little bit, because this was clearly very, very important in Jesus' ministry. And if it's important to Jesus, it needs to be important to us. Racism. Well, what is racism? 3 definitions for you. Racism: a belief that all members of each race possess characteristics and abilities specific to that race, so as to distinguish it as inferior or superior to another race. Racism: prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against someone of a different race based on the belief that one's own race is superior. Racism consists of beliefs and practices that seek to justify or cause the unequal distribution of privileges, rights, or goods among different racial groups. You'll notice throughout all three of these definitions, there's a combination of beliefs, there's a combination of actions in what we do. We have a long history of racism. It goes way back. We see racism in the Bible. Several different stories talk about racism. We have a long history in our country of justifying racism, sometimes referring back to some of those early stories and letting us know that racism is sanctioned by God, quote unquote, which we know today is not true. But racism is in our history. Racism is here in Pennsylvania. All we really have to do is spend some time and talk to some people in our area, and we know that racism is still around us. If you have an opportunity, talk to some of our people who are Americans of Greek descent. We have a Greek Orthodox church just 10 minutes away from here. And they could tell you some things about how racial prejudice has limited job options, has limited where they could live, or has limited the friendships that they could have. Talk to some people who are Americans of African descent. We have Brightside Baptist Church, just not that far away from the Greek Orthodox Church. And they too could talk to you about how racism is too much a part of our society, and how it's still a major, major problem, and how it influences every aspect of their life, limiting the jobs that they can apply for, limiting the places where they can live, limiting the friendships that they can have. The list goes on. We could also talk about Americans of Hispanic descent. And by the way, I know we struggle to know how to deal with referring to different folks. I came across this vocabulary of saying Americans of African descent, Americans of Hispanic descent, and so forth. And I like that because that puts us all relatively on equal footing. Many of us here today would be Americans of European descent. At first, I didn't quite like it because it's kind of a long statement. It's a little awkward. But the more I thought of it, the more I like it. Because if I have to refer to something as trite as where we come from, it should be a little awkward. But talk to people. We, by the way, are not the experts on racism, because most of us here tend to be of the privileged class. So for us, racism can easily disappear. To know what racism is about, we need to talk to people who have experienced it. We are at somewhat of a disadvantage. And true, every now and then, racism gets a little beyond the comfort zone, and it turns into violence. It turns into newspaper front cover stories. And all too often when that happens, we tend to push it under the rug, pretend it didn't happen. We lose it. We're happy to lose it to history. When I studied history, I didn't know anything about the Paxton Boys. I didn't know anything about the Blue-Eyed Six. I didn't know about the events that took place in Duffy's Cut. But it's part of our history. Racism continues. It continues today. But why does it persist? Why doesn't it just disappear? What's behind the fact that it just goes on and on and on? Are we lacking information? Are we lacking stories? Maybe we need a new story from the Old Testament, one that we really haven't focused on, or one that's fallen outside of our Jewish tradition, that's not in the Bible. I mean, true, we do have some stories. We have the story of Ruth, a beautiful story. If you were here at Heritage and Horizons, you'd know the full story about Ruth and the racist attitudes that story fell into. Ruth wasn't a Jew, she was a Moabite from Moab. A lot of racial issues there. Job, Jonah. The Old Testament is dealing with racial prejudice and challenging that to put an end to it. Maybe we need to understand some different parables of Jesus. Jesus has a lot to say about racism. We see that in his stories. Paul has a lot to say about racism. Maybe we need to focus in on some of those stories, or maybe, hopefully, as we're discovering some of these new gospels that are emerging, maybe there's some new stories that will help us understand and put racism aside. Or maybe we need some more speeches. We have some really good speeches about racism and putting racism asleep. William Seward, back in the 1850s, became he was gifted. He came up with several one-liners that turned into newspaper headlines against slavery, against racism. Maybe we need to look at some of those. And Abraham Lincoln, speech after speech, challenging us to put aside racism, reminding us that we are a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men, all people are created equal. And then going on to announce a new birth of freedom. A new birth of freedom for many they're still waiting for. And then, of course, we have speeches by Martin Luther King, profound speeches by Martin Luther King, challenging us to put an end to racism and sharing with us a simple dream. A dream when he said, I long for the day when my children will not be judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. Again, a dream that we still are waiting for. Would more speeches, would more parables, would more stories help us today to move past racism? I say no. I think we have enough information. I think we have enough knowledge. I think we have enough understanding of right and wrong. Today we need action. And the phrase reject racism implies action. We need to attack some of the roots of racism. What are those roots? There's several. When we start to study racism, we see that racism permeates virtually every aspect of our society. And again, most of us here are of the privileged class, so we don't see it. But it's all around us. One of those roots, I think, is simply founded in fear. It's founded in an unfounded fear. But oftentimes we're concerned that there's just not enough to go around. There's not enough good jobs to go around. And so we need to protect, we need to create an us and a them, and yet make sure that the good jobs go to us. There's not enough power to go around. There's not enough privilege. There's not enough access. In our scripture, we hear what can happen when we have access. We tend to try to use that access. But not everyone has equal access. Fear. I would say fear is one of the roots of racism. One that we probably don't like to hear about or even consider because I'm not afraid of anything. But if we talk about racism, we have to be honest with one another. We have to be open. Fortunately, when I read the teachings of Jesus, I see a way out. I see clearly a way forward. When we dig into his stories, when we dig into his parables, he's directing, he's leading, he's pointing to a way forward. He's assuring us that there is enough. And we see this story after story after story. There is enough. We see this with the feeding of the 5,000. There's enough for the Jewish people. The feeding of the 4,000. There's enough for the Gentiles. That's just about everybody in the world. But Jesus makes it very clear that in the presence of divine distributive justice, there is enough. And it's hard for us, I think, out of fear, to really think about that. I think in one way, in a very real way, the question boils down to, do we trust Jesus? Do we believe Jesus? Do we believe Jesus enough that we're willing to take some risk? To, even though I don't understand quite what these stories are telling me, I'm willing to dig. I'm willing to search. Do we believe? Do we trust Jesus and his teachings? If we're going to move forward with this and really work to reject racism, it's going to be a lot of hard work. A lot of hard work. And it's nothing that I could answer in 20 minutes of your time. The most that I can do is raise the awareness that racism is way, way too alive and well in our society today. Racism is too alive and well in the world around us. And when I talk to some of my friends who are Americans of African descent, or when I talk to some of my friends who are Americans of Hispanic descent, and ask them, how are things today? Are they really much better than they were? Please, do you trust our conversations to tell me? And what I hear, things aren't that much different. And I hear that over and over. And I know that they're the experts on racism. I'm not. This is a serious problem. And as Christians, we have an opportunity to dig into the scriptures and understand the story within the story of some of these ancient teachings, and we have a way forward. And I would challenge us. Not everyone. I know that everyone isn't going to take a project like racism on, but my hope and my prayer is that right here at COA, there might be 10 or 15 people who would want to really dig into racism. And maybe there already are, but there's more work to be done. Well, golly, Dave, just, I guess racism is alive and well, but I don't think I'm part of the problem. I mean, I got black friends. They're good people. I don't hate anyone. Don't tell me that. Because if you believe that statement, that I'm not a part of the problem because I have some black friends and I don't hate anyone, you're telling me that you don't understand racism. It permeates all around us. 2 books that I would recommend, 2 pieces of literature. I said we had enough information, and we do. But we got to dig in, we got to understand it. 2 things I would ask you to seriously spend some time with. The letter from Birmingham jail. Martin Luther King wrote this letter when he was in jail to 8 clergymen back in 1963. The profoundness of this letter continues to speak to us today. And Martin Luther King, in pages, captures reality. I would ask you to read that letter aloud. Read it to a friend, to your spouse. Read it aloud to yourself. Don't just sit and read quietly. Try to mimic some of Martin Luther King's voice inflections. Get into that letter. And before, I mentioned to you a little book called The Powers That Be. Walter Wink wrote this. I again give you this book. Walter Wink talks about the domination system. And frankly, if we don't understand the domination system, I don't think there's really any way that we're going to really understand the parables of Jesus. Because the domination system was alive and well in Jesus' day, and it's still alive and well today. And it gives us an understanding of the difference between Jesus' way and Caesar's way. Both lead to peace. But Caesar's way to peace is violence, domination, and then imposed justice, which is going to favor me because I won, and then we have peace. Jesus' way is justice through nonviolent means, which then leads to peace. So if you're on one of the church committees, sometimes we refer to peace and justice issues. I would challenge you to turn that around because Jesus' way is justice and then peace. So if you serve on a committee like that, I serve on the Justice and Peace Committee. I serve on Jesus' committee. Racism. I got to quit. Racism today is alive and well. Too well. We don't need more speeches. We don't need sermons. We need action. We need to reject racism all around us. But in order to reject it, we have to really understand how racism permeates throughout every bit of our society. Oh, my word, we've had the Great Society. We've been fighting racism for 50, 100 years. Isn't that enough? Nope, sorry, it isn't. It's been going on for thousands and thousands of years. It permeates us so much we don't even recognize it when we do it. We need to understand racism. Reject racism. the challenge of the church, the challenge of the United Church of Christ, the challenge of all of us. Learn and do.